Hello, welcome to One Day at a Time Forest Bathing YouTube channel. If you've been here before, it's nice to see you back again, and if you haven't, I hope you find it a pleasant experience. If you'd care to hit the subscribe, the like button, that would be very helpful and much appreciated. As you can see from some of the previous content on this channel, it's not only about forest bathing, it's also about counselling related matters and also just a bit of a general life vlog. And today I really want to take some time to share my views on something that I'm very passionate about in the counselling world. So as the sun's streaming through the windows, casting all sorts of weird shadows, I hope you can bear with that. But you know what? First week in September to have this sun, after the week's rain we've had, nothing to be sneezed at. But going back to what it is I'd like to talk about, being a qualified counsellor, I'm in my third year post-qualification, third year of private practice, and I've become aware of trends. And what I'm about to say are really observations. I really have no issue with what I'm about to comment on. So I can remember a time when it was the Me Too organisation and the trend in counselling and training for counsellors. The majority of it catered to that. Various other ones have been the LGBTQ+I, transgender, racism, particularly people of a different heritage than my white Caucasian heritage, their experience in counselling and in the world. And I think it's really, really good that there's a platform for all of those. I don't have an axe to grind about them. But just recently, perhaps a more disturbing trend, fad, for want of a better way of describing it, seems to be engulfing our trade, our profession, and it's trauma. And it just feels that everybody and anybody is calling themselves trauma-informed, trauma-aware, trauma practitioners. And I care very much not only about trauma practice but also about clients being best served when they come to see a counsellor. But rather than just go off the deep end, I've done a little bit of exploration about it. And perhaps I'll recant to you something that a conversation that I was party to. I sat in a chat room. I think I was the fifth counsellor there, and two of the five counsellors were talking about trauma and how they experienced it in their practice. Client trauma, not their own trauma. And with quite a degree of difficulty, I had to bite my tongue. And I just sort of try to envisage how it would be for a client who's been through traumatic events, been traumatised, what their experience would be in the room with these two counsellors. But I listened, and the more I listened, the more it became apparent to me that actually two counsellors that are doing the talking aren't trauma informed. They might be trauma aware, but they're not trauma informed. They're certainly not trauma qualified. And immediately my trauma training, I'm a clinically certified trauma therapist, which makes me sound big and proper and professional, but it means that what I've done is I've taken the time and I've paid the money to learn the skills necessary to counsel clients who have had trauma with a capital T or trauma with a small t. And the discussion that I was party to caused me to think, actually, I don't think there's evidence in the chat about trauma-informed practice. So let's pause it there for a little bit. I'm a person-centred therapist, and that's the modality that I trained in, and it has taught me to behave, to be a counsellor in a certain way. And when I see clients who are traumatised, I explain explicitly and sometimes repeatedly that if I am aware that that client is going back into a re-traumatised state, then my behaviour will change markedly. And I'll give you a little bit of an instance of it. I will become very abrupt. I will become very direct. I will ground you. I will ask you, what is it that you can see in this room? What does the chair feel like that you're sitting on? Who am I? What am I wearing? Until you have regulated yourself back to the normal state, not the traumatised state. So that's just a little example, and it's known in my world as grounding. So going back to the discussion that I was part of, or I became part of, none of that was apparent. And that surprised me, that shocked me. An overarching theme in counselling is to practice non-maleficence. That is nothing that is bad for the client. And I think that allowing a client to revisit that trauma, to be re-traumatised, isn't good. So I did my training with two very well-esteemed people in the trauma world who have got over 30 years practice speaking and counselling directly to people that are traumatised. They're properly qualified in terms of teaching and also in terms of trauma qualifications. So I went back into the discussion and gently, softly, I started asking some open-ended questions, and it became apparent on my original view that actually the two people that are talking, undoubtedly well-intentioned, not deliberately setting out to traumatise people, didn't have a clue. And I offered a couple of suggestions where they could pick up some basic trauma training, they could qualify. And after about 40 minutes, I left the room, but it sat uncomfortably with me. A couple of days later, I wrote an article for my counselling directory platform that I advertise my services as a counsellor on. And in those couple of days, I became aware, or more aware, of it becoming a trend. One of my fellow counsellors related to me as somebody who has been practicing for 8 years, calls themselves somebody who deals with trauma, with no qualifications in counselling, no qualifications in trauma, no awareness of the need for clinical supervision, not being bound by the strictures of an ethical best practice. Wow. So this is something that we are made aware of in my training. I never thought I'd experience it so bold and so brazen. I can't really do a lot about other people and how other people practice. I'd like to see the counselling profession go a certain way, and if you're aware of counselling, a scheme that is being launched, is in process of coming into effect. It's known as ScopeHead, and that is supposedly to give the public who are seeking counsellors a better idea of the level of qualification, the length of practice, the quality of qualifications that the counsellors have. I'm not the only one, but I do not think that it is addressing that need. It strikes very, very much as a box-ticking exercise, and I'm aghast at it. I'm going to have to submit to it, purely for financial reasons. It's totally voluntary, but for financial reasons I'm going to have to commit to it, and I don't like it at all. That's quite black and white. If it means that a client isn't going to encounter the counsellor that I mentioned earlier with no qualifications, no training, then I think it's a good thing. But I'm also aware that there are some very highly qualified counsellors in the counselling world, far more highly qualified than I am, and they are academically gifted. They're very, very accomplished. Would I want them as a counsellor? No, I'm afraid I wouldn't, because despite their qualifications, despite their demonstrable skills, their exam results, etc., they lack something that a man called Pete Thorne first referred to in A State of Me. And a quote that I often use from him is, the only thing that matters in a counselling relationship is the relationship. So they're highly skilled, highly qualified counsellors with all that entails, good and bad. I doubt very much that they'd be able to establish a therapeutic relationship, or a satisfactory one, and perhaps, to be really precise, one that would satisfy me as a client, as opposed to being a counsellor. So I'm being quite diverse at the moment in my ramblings. I'm aware of that. As much as people find comfort in givens, in boundaries, in structures, etc., I'm very much a believer in you can be the most highly qualified counsellor, but the worst, the counsellor who's giving their clients the worst experience. And conversely, I've been privileged to train with people that aren't as academically gifted, myself as included, but absolutely wonderful, beneficial counsellors. So that last little bit is just about, as I understand the counselling world that I live and I operate in, more specifically with trauma counselling. Earlier on I mentioned trauma with a capital T and trauma with a small t. Well, the capital T, or trauma spelt with a capital T and uppercase T, refers to life-threatening events. And the lowercase spelling of the word trauma with the lowercase t refers to perhaps not life-threatening events, but life-affecting events. So it might be that actually you've had your leg bitten by a dog. Probably not going to threaten your life, but it can still have the same traumatic responses. And I've trained and I'm able to recognise those traumatic responses, and I'm able to conduct sessions where those responses are dealt with appropriately. One of the lovely things I enjoy doing is showing clients how it's possible to recognise that they're going into a traumatised state, and then being able to how to regulate it. The thing with traumatised states, for the person who's in a traumatised state, it is exactly the same. The physiological responses to the original event are there. It is as if they are back in that circumstance again. Wow. So it follows from that actually, unless you're able to control the session and to regulate the session, unless the client is able to control and regulate themselves, you run the risk of the client going out of the room in a really, really poor state, and it can be devastating. That's not something that I feel is good. Now, to be generous, current phase of trauma-informed, trauma-aware, trauma best practice, all being used on people's self-promotion. I accept that the intention is good. I understand that a lot of it is to appeal to a wider part of the population. But is it actually doing the client any good, or is it doing them harm? I wonder. I doubt very much that it is doing the client any good. And I have to be aware of that. Now, I can't change anything. I can't change anybody. But what I will say, if you're watching this, if you know somebody who's experienced trauma, with a capital T or a lowercase t, please ask them to shop around. Ask them, if they're seeking therapy, to ask specifically for any potential counsellor's qualifications. An honest and an open and upright counsellor will have no problem with being asked for their qualifications, and they'll have no problems. They'll be readily available. They'll be more than happy to produce them and to show them. So beware of people that obfuscate, people that avoid. Just be very, very careful. Wow, didn't expect that to take so long. But, sometimes all it takes for evil to prosper is a few good men to do nothing. It's a very old phraseology, but I think the meaning of that is still valid. And I'm doing something. I'm not doing nothing. I don't know what effect that will have. But if one person speaks to somebody after having listened to me and manages to guide, to offer advice to somebody who's seeking help for trauma, then perhaps that's enough. To round up, I'm looking at over 1,000 hours of previous client work, and certain trends come to mind. One of them is an ACE. That stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Without doing the math, I can say that between 60 and 80% of my clients, at some point, adverse childhood experiences are brought into the room. And this might be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years after those events. They can be considered to be trauma. Now, there's a school of thought that the people that have survived the trauma and that are living through it, or having lived past it, they've dealt with it adequately. And undoubtedly there are people out there who have. But for those who are struggling with it, those who are experiencing it as damaging their lives, ruining their quality of life, please seek help. I'm more than happy to offer my help, and I hope that we can get on. But it doesn't matter if it's me or if it's another qualified counsellor. If you're experiencing trauma, find yourself a counsellor. It doesn't get better by itself. It requires effort. Unfortunately, the times we live in, that requires money. But I don't know of any counsellor that is so cold-hearted, so stone cold and callous, that they're averse to having conversations about money. You don't always get what you pay for in the counselling world, but seek out that help, please. On the subject of seeking out help and the cost of help, myself as a counsellor, since I qualified, I've given roughly 500 hours for 1,000 hours I've done free of charge or reduced rate. Now I need to pay my bills. I'm entitled, my qualifications and my experience entitle me to charge a fee for it. But I'm not a cold-hearted human being. And I'm happy when it's necessary, when it's beneficial, to offer reduced or occasionally free counselling. I'd rather somebody had counselling for free, benefited from it, than didn't have any counselling because they couldn't afford it and had no benefits. So, a lovely sunny Saturday afternoon. Beautiful weather we've had today. Tomorrow I'm going to try to get to a community orchard and do some forest bathing videos. So keep your eyes peeled for them. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I wish you all the best. And should you want to, I look forward to hearing from you. Take care. Bye.